Parliament has been popping off in the last few days. I mean, like, Parliament is back in full swing, and boy, am I enjoying it. So, within the last few days, Saddam Hussein has delivered one of the biggest bombings in Parliament to the PNM government, and boy, was I there for it. I have to admit that when it comes to this young man, he's genuinely one of the brightest prospects that the United National Congress has. And I can see him definitely in the future being the leader of the United National Congress. The guy just has the pedigree for it. He knows how to just deliver his statements in Parliament and tit for tat. The guy is just really good at it. But as I went through, the stuff that he was laying in Parliament, and we took a look at all the millions of dollars that the PNM would have actually stolen in forms of legal fees, it had me digging up and thinking in my head that, a lot of the times when citizens hear the term sue the state, they don't actually understand what it means. Some people, we just know that we lose our tax-paying dollars. But I always found it very strange. How come we never riot, in the words of Colin Imbert, or we never actually lost our cool or got angry? Because, again, it's our tax-paying dollars that is literally going down the drain. But I think the reason why a lot of people never actually reacted to this thing taking place is because of one simple reason. They don't actually see the money leave their pockets. And I can guarantee that. Because you see, back in the old days, when taxes was collected for kings or for lords, you would have men go around the city and they would collect these taxes, by force. They would show up to your door physically and take your things. They'll take your money, they'll take items, they'll take jewelry, whatever they could find. And they would fill it in a chest and they would drag these chests all throughout the city. Now, because they were doing stuff like that, you would now have a scenario where the people, they could have actually seen their wealth going up the street, their very last dollars and cents being taken away from them by force, by armed guards. And if it was a case that you didn't pay your taxes, you could have hanged, you could have lost your life, or in some cases, lose everything you have. But as time went by, taxes became modernized and taxes became a way that was now taken by the government in the forms of items and things that you would have. You know that they're touching your money, but because it doesn't physically leave your hand, you don't feel as jaded or you don't feel like you've actually lost anything. And I think because of that, a lot of citizens don't really understand what it is when the government loses in court or when the government has to pay absurd amount of legal fees. Now, it's one thing, and I've always said this before, the PNM has cultivated a society, especially their voter base, in ignorance. So there's a lot of things they don't understand. And when they use these big words in Parliament, or Phil Gerald Hine comes and puts out these big statements and uses these big words, it's to confuse the population because majority of their voter base, they're not really that smart. So I decided to take a deep dive into it to kind of figure out why it goes this way, because you can't be losing all these court cases and then we have a conflict of interest, which is government ministers actually being lawyers and attorney, which we all know. Most parliamentarians are lawyers and attorneys in their own right. But then you have them earning money from the government purse, in large sums of money from the government purse, to the point where now some of them are threatening Saddam Hussein to sue him because he basically put it out into the public domain how much money they were actually earning within the 9 years. And boy, was it a feeding frenzy. And Saddam bombed them really good. But you see, the reality of it is this. A lot of times when we hear conflict of interest, there's a word that is tossed around in Parliament that a lot of people don't actually understand what that word means. And that word is recuse. a lot of the times you would hear parliament ministers use that term, especially on the PNM side within the last 9 years. You would hear them use that word recuse, 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 but a lot of people don't understand what it means. And I tested the theory. Just this week here, I had several conversations with people. They didn't want to be videotaped, but I asked them, who did you vote for the election? If it was a PNM or a UNC. And funny enough, majority of the people that I spoke to did not know what the meaning of recuse meant, especially when it was used in parliament. Now, the reason why recused is used in parliament is when there's a conflict of interest with personal assets or personal things clashing with the government purse. And in some cases like that, we've had a lot of ministers under the PNM, right, recuse themselves from parliament because items that came up in parliament was a conflict of interest with their own personal agendas. This would sometimes happen when it comes to government contracts, when it comes to family members and friends having government contracts, which I genuinely believe is something that should not be allowed to happen. But most of the time, when these conflicts of interest would come up in parliament, a parliament minister would just simply say, I recuse myself from parliament, or I recuse myself from this situation, basically removing himself from the scenario that involves either family members or friends, and therefore giving himself a free pass out of not having to deal with the judgment of parliament. And that is why when Saddam Hussein brought the documents to parliament, he was able to show how many ministers would have benefited under the PNM government where legal fees was concerned. And I know a lot of you all might be thinking, well, hey, it can't be that bad. But it is really that bad, because every time you hear the state gets sued, it doesn't come from the government pocket. It doesn't come from the ministers in parliament pocket. It comes from the citizens of the country, you and I. But the reason why we don't take it that serious is because it's not physically taken away from our hand. If it was a case that every time the state was sued, somebody would show up in front of your house and they would physically take that money from your pocket or from your home, you would see a whole different reaction from the people in society, because the physical form of the currency or the item is being removed from you. Now, let's look at some of the really nonsense lawsuits that I basically followed. This thing with the migrants. I remember this scenario where this case came up where a migrant child was kept in our detention unit, and basically the state was awarded to pay this young man, this little child, 2 point something million dollars. I want you all to sit and think about that for a minute. You flee your country. You come into my country illegally. We detain you for coming into our country illegally. And because of the conditions that we detained you in, you turn around and sue my country for 2 point something billion dollars. I want you all to sit down and let us sink in. So imagine you being an illegal immigrant and coming to a nation and becoming a millionaire because of the nation's incompetence. The people who held them weren't held accountable. The government was not held accountable. The detainment center was not held accountable. You know who was held accountable? You and I, the state. And when you're thinking that after making a faux pas like that, they couldn't turn around and do it a second time, they actually did. They turned around and they messed up in the detention center a second time. And this time we had to pay 3 Venezuelan children over $1 million. So that seems to be the new plan now. Come to Trinidad as an illegal immigrant, get detained, and then when you get detained, sue the state. And because our attorneys, right, and we could point out Faris for this, because Faris was losing everything. Faris was literally losing everything. He didn't win a case, right? Then you had Washed Up Scotland losing everything. Then you had Marcel losing everything. Our attorneys, those PNM attorneys, wasn't winning a case. And every time they lost, the state got sued, but they filled their pockets with huge amount of revenue in legal fees. I want you all to think about that. And then the reason why we don't feel affected by it or we don't feel jaded by it is because we don't physically see the revenue leave our pocket. We don't understand that. We don't understand when they say recuse or they pull themselves. We have to look at all these contracts that was awarded to family members, right? From the Brian Lara Stadium being the cost to clean the Brian Lara Stadium, to who the contract, the family members that these contracts was awarded to. We sit down here and I've always tell people this. It's not that no government doesn't thief, but when the PNM thief, you don't really notice the thieving because the PNM has more practice. They've been in government longer. So when they actually steal, it doesn't look like they're stealing. But this is how they do it. Imagine you're seeing attorneys with $1 million in legal fees. I want you all to think about that. Think about the divers with the pariah situation, where we spent more money to actually de-escalate the situation when we could have just paid off the families. We spent more money in an investigation to find out what went on. And still those families haven't been awarded a cent. And after we spent all that money, they lost. They lost. The families came out on top. And up to now, they still haven't been paid. And this is what the government has been doing with the taxpayers' revenue of Trinidad and Tobago for the longest while. But the only problem with that is you don't physically see the revenue leave your hands. So because it doesn't leave your hand physically, you don't feel jaded. But I must commend the United National Congress on what they are doing. The key to winning Trinidad and Tobago and keeping Trinidad and Tobago on their toes is by presenting the receipts so that people could see how disgusting the PNM ran the country for the last 9 years. You could never beat receipts. And that is what Keith Rowley, I don't understand how these people allowed Keith Rowley to even run this country for 9 years, because he came in to government stating that Kamala Persad-Bissessar and our whole government was to make jail because they stole and they did nothing but corruption. Up to this day, he hasn't presented a proper receipt or a proper case to back up his claim. He went into government for a second term on the mantra of the same thing, that Kamala Persad-Bissessar and her team stole and that they were going to make jail. And he still hasn't brought those receipts to the table to this day. But here it is. We have Saddam Hussein bringing receipts showing where the government was literally mismanaging the country, where government attorneys was filling their pockets, right? Where taxes was being collected through the property tax and we don't know where the revenue for the property tax money went, right? You're seeing all these apartment complex and buildings that are being rented out by government ministers. All these conflict of interest touching you and I, our tax-paying dollars. And you need to ask yourself a genuine question. Why aren't you bothered by this? Why aren't we rioting? Why aren't we taking our protest to the Red House? It's because the money doesn't physically leave our hands. And because we don't actually see it taken from us physically, we don't feel jaded enough or obligated enough to fight for it. But I want you all to understand this. Every time you hear the line, the state was sued, it wasn't the government of Trinidad and Tobago. It wasn't anybody who was accountable for the reason why the state was sued. They didn't pay a cent. You and I did. Make a better version of yourself, Trinidad and Tobago. And if you reach this far in the video, hit the like, the subscribe, and the share button. And let's have a conversation in the comment section below. I'm curious, do you all think that what Saddam Hussein did in Parliament was the correct thing by showing the receipts? Do you think that government ministers should be allowed to have government contracts? Let us have a conversation in the comment section. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. So with that, make a better version of yourself, Trinidad and Tobago. I out.